Hey guys, it's Jake here and Bandit, Canadian Cutting Edge. This is the first in our terminology series of videos, my BKN series, my Badass Knife Newbies basic series of videos. We're going to talk about the terminology for the parts of a knife, specifically the blade today. Not different types of knives, but just the different parts of them. I started this recording on Saturday morning, and by the time I was done recording, I had well over an hour worth of footage, which is a lot. And then I started editing Saturday afternoon, Sunday, turns into Monday. Now it's Tuesday morning. You haven't seen a video for a few days, and I'm finally getting ready. And I finished editing it, but I want to record this new intro. So this is just going to be names of parts and a little bit about why they are the way they are, or how they are, or some details about those parts. If you just want the names of parts, that's all you want. Down below in the description area, I've got some links for some sites that you can look up the names of parts. This video is more than just the names of stuff. I'm going to talk about those things. So if that's what you want, stick around. The video's coming at you right now. Okay, the very first thing I want to say is knives are as much art as they are science, if you will. What I mean is there's technical things about knives that are cut and dried, but there's also a lot of fuzzy areas about knives because they're also artistic pieces. At least they can be both. At least I think most of them are both. And even the parts of a blade can vary in what they're called depending on where you live, what language your background is, like if you're from a Germanic area or if you're from, an Asian area, or it all depends. There's so many variabilities, and it depends on so many different things. All I want to say is that there aren't a lot of right and wrong answers when it comes to naming the parts of the knives. There's just the most common terms that are used in the West today. That's what I'm going to try to do. And even then, it varies from region to region. So I don't want a bunch of comments down below telling me, you're wrong, such and such part is called such and such. Go ahead and talk about that stuff if you want to, but this video is not about what's right and what's wrong. It's just about the terminology of the parts of a knife that I have come to be very familiar with and use. So when you're watching my channel, when I use these terms, this is what they're going to be referring to. And generally speaking, most people in Western English-speaking countries will refer to the knife parts the same basic way. Again, badass knife newbies, that's who I'm talking to. Because there's a lot of people who get into knives and you start off usually in the low budget area and you want to learn a lot about knives. And so here we go. I'm going to be talking about this part, this metal part sticking out the front, not so much about this handle, although this transition area on some knives, some parts are on the metal part of the blade, and on some knives, some of these parts are on the other materials used for a handle. So we'll get into this section a little bit as well. So I drew a couple different styles of knives right here. There are a whole lot more. And depending on the style of the blade, some knives have some parts and some knives don't have some other parts. And so not all knives have all of these parts. We're going to start at the tip of the blade and work our way that way and come across with some terms. Let's finally get there. This part of the blade right here, that's the easiest one. That's the tip of the blade, the tip of the knife. Almost all knives have a tip. Now, not all knives do, because some knives have a little rounded section, and so technically it's the tip, but it doesn't have like a single point as a tip. But that's very common, easy to tell. Belly. The belly of the knife is along the cutting edge, where my fingernail's touching, and it's a curved section. So some kind of radius of a curved section of the cutting edge, and it almost always starts at the belly and moves down the knife. So we've got a belly here, we've got a belly here, and we've got a belly here. Any style of knife has got something of a belly. Some knives like this one have a belly and then a long, flat, straight section. Some knives don't have much of one at all. They just got all belly, and that's just the way it is. So that's easy. Now, the side of the knife, this edge here that they've done some work on, some grinding work to make it thinner to come to the edge, the side of this knife here, that's called the bevel, sometimes called the main bevel. Now, the bevel can be across the entire surface of the knife side, or it can be like this one. This one's much easier to tell because you've got your silvery, shiny area, and you've got your dark black area. So the black area is how this steel came from the steel factory. And then this part here, that's shiny, that's the bevel. That's where material has been taken off to bring the knife down towards the cutting edge. So that part is the bevel, or the main bevel. And then you have the next part. So this knife is a full flat grind knife, which means that the grind starts right at the very, this edge of the knife, the back, the spine, and it comes all the way down to the cutting edge. Steel has been removed across the entire surface of this knife. And so that's the main bevel. And then you've got your edge grind, which is this section here. It's a couple millimeters wide, probably 1.5 millimeters, a little over a 1/16 of an inch, not quite 2/16, like an eighth. But it's just a little bit of an edge steel taken off, just the last little part, so that you can get it right to a cutting edge. But the grind here can have a couple of different things on it. But before we talk about that, let's talk about where does this end? Like on this knife, it ends right here. You can see this nice black area. That's the flat part. And then they started grinding there. It's also called the plunge termination point, or the plunge grind. That's where it starts getting thinner until they get to a standard angle of grinding this bevel. So that transition point right there, it can be, a smooth sort of rounded thing. It can be, this one's another example of a nice gradual sort of rounded grind in there. Or it can be here we go, this knife has got a fairly abrupt grind. It goes almost straight down. So if you look at it from this edge here, it's the full thickness, and then very quickly it comes down to the grind. And so that plunge is this one's not quite a square plunge, but a square plunge is when it comes straight down and then you've got it. And then a rounded plunge is more like this one, where it's gradual and it takes some time. All right, so that's the plunge. So we've got a lot of things covered already. Now let's talk about this actual grind right on the edge. I'll show you on this bigger knife because it's a little bit easier to see. So we've got an edge. This time it's almost 1/8 of an inch, not quite. All the edge grind all the way along. And what some knives have is right at the very, very edge, and it's almost, sometimes you can't see it with the naked eye, sometimes you can, it depends on the person. They do another grind to make a micro bevel. I'm going to draw you a diagram of what I mean, so hopefully it'll make sense. And the diagram will be looking at, the edge from this perspective. So here's the knife. I'm going to turn it like this, and from this perspective, looking down at the edge right there, what this looks like. Watch this. Okay, so here I've got a diagram. Now this whole diagram, edge of the paper here to the tip of this drawing here, imagine that's about 1/4 of an inch, about 8 millimeters. That whole long section, that's how closely we're focused in. So this main part here, that's the bevel. That's this shiny part right here, the bevel. And then you've got your edge grind. That is that narrow, really shiny part there. And then at the very tip, it's got another part that's done at even a greater angle than your edge grind. Now, by the way, your edge grind for most knives, like a knife, this size, or, a folding knife like this, it's usually around 20 degrees per side. And then you've got that right there, which is going to be greater than 20 degrees. Not less than, can't be less than, it's got to be greater than 20 degrees if this is 20 degrees. And so that's another edge to sharpen up. Some people do that just so that they don't have to sharpen this entire edge grind. They just sharpen the tip a little bit, And all you have to do is take a stone and very gently, with a fairly high grit stone usually, and just polish up that edge to make it a little bit sharper again. You can only do that a few times before you end up getting too blunt, and then you have to sharpen your entire edge grind again. But I find that sort of defeats the purpose, because once you've gotten it too blunt, then, you know, the next time you're going to have to grind all the way to the middle of that point, because that's going to be flat. To get rid of that whole flat section, you're going to have to take off a lot more steel. So I tend not to do micro grinds, micro bevels. I just don't prefer them. I like just to do a new edge grind, bring it to a new point on the edge, and there you go. Now, why would you want to do a micro bevel? Well, sometimes some steels get a little chippy. Like if a D2 steel, if you've got an old knife, D2 steel from about 50 years ago or so, there's a chance, well, even some younger ones, recent ones, if it was hardened to a really high degree, like 62, 63 Rockwell hardness, then the edge is going to be chippy, and it tends to break off on things that you cut. And so if you've got chippy D2, that's just one example, then a micro bevel will help strengthen that edge because it's on a greater angle that you're cutting from. And so there are some good reasons to use micro bevels. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just tend not to use them on my knives. So there we got the bevel done, the edge grind, and the micro bevel. Now, some knives have serrations, and believe it or not, I don't have one of those knives. Why? I don't really like serrations. Serrated knives, I'm not too fond of them. Now, there's some reasons to have serrated knives, and there's some good reasons to have serrated knives. I just don't have any for that purpose. But a serration is, I'll show you some pictures of knives with serrations. It's parts of the blade that are cut in with teeth. It comes from the idea of having a saw blade. You know, a saw blade is designed to cut through wood or some really dense material. And, you know, those teeth grab in and pull out a chunk, and they grab in again and pull out a chunk. And so serrations are for, you know, biting in and pulling chunks apart, whereas a fine ground edge is for slicing into and through. Sometimes you just need serrations for certain kinds of material, and that's just as simple as it is. And there's loads of different types of serrations. Most common these days is a partly serrated blade where you've got serrations here, and then on the belly, you've got a nice fine edge. Sometimes you've got the entire knife being serrated. I've got one knife that has serrations. That's kind of odd. And it's got serrations just on the belly, which is kind of weird. But there you go. There's that. The next part we've talked about serrations is a recurve. A lot of knives these days are starting to have recurves on them. So here I've got a knife with a recurve. This is actually an older land knife, and you can see it. The blade has a belly, and it's like the belly keeps going too far, and then they have to, fix it and come back again. And so you've got a opposite of a belly, you've got an indented section that's sharp. So what it really is, what this is a huge serration. Think of it that way. So this recurve is like a bit of a one-tooth serration section in just the belly part of it. So a lot of things slice better when they have a sort of edge that goes around them. So you're cutting through something rounded, and you want to cut into it like a piece of rope or something, and you end up having more edge surface on the material at any given time when it's, you know, just sort of wraps around the material. That helps with a lot of things. Now, sharpening a recurve gets trickier, and we're not talking about sharpening in this video. So that's why a number of people don't want knives with recurves. They'd rather have a nice simple belly and then a straight section because that's easier to sharpen. And recurves come in all varying degrees of, you know, it can be a very tight radius, so a really big recurve, or it can be a very gentle little change, all kinds. But that's a recurve right in there. What's the next? Next thing that we're going to talk about is a sharpener's choil, also called a Spanish notch, sometimes just called a choil by some people. Here's a knife with one. This section here that's been cut away, that's what we're talking about. That's the Spanish notch or sharpener's choil. Why do we have them? There's one main reason to have them, and that is when it comes to sharpening the knife, it's easier to finish sharpening right here when you've got a nice sharpener's choil, if it comes out far enough. And the thing is, the sharpener's choil has to come past this plunge all the way until the main bevel is at its normal thickness. Otherwise, it doesn't really help you very much at all. So this notch here, this choil, comes far enough that it terminates after the plunge terminates. Okay, so that's a good sharpener's choil. What's a bad sharpener's choil look like? Let's go back to this knife. That's one of the worst ones that I have on me right now down here in the basement. So let's take a look. So what we have here is they put the sharpener's choil in, but the sharpener's choil terminates where the plunge begins. And so we have to, if we want to sharpen to the edge of the knife, we get this kind of issue. We get a part where the steel starts getting thicker and thicker and thicker, but I'm still not at the edge of the grind. And so I have to grind up the side of the bevel, and that's just ugly. So there's a lot of wrong ways to make a sharpener's choil, and that's one of the beefs I have with the modern knives these days, especially the budget ones. Very often, either they don't put a sharpener's choil on, or they put a bad sharpener's choil on. Now, I'd rather have none than a bad one, to be honest with you. I'd much rather have this than to have this. I will be making a video soon on how to fix that, how to do that, but that's a totally separate issue. Now, what's the next step? There's another thing called a choil, and that's a finger choil. Now, you can have a number of different types of finger choils. You can have a half and half choil. You can get a full choil. Here's a knife by Sanrenmu. This is the S721 that came out quite recently. And it's super obvious on this knife that that spot there isn't really a sharpener's choil. It's a place to put your finger. So you can put your finger in there, and then you're really close up to the sharp part of the blade so that you've got a whole lot more control on how to use that. And that's really, really useful. That's called a finger choil or a forward choil. This is your main choil right here, and almost all knives have one of those, but that's getting into the handle. That's a forward choil. Now, what we have is all kinds of different shapes. This knife, it's sort of squared off. Well, it's not a square. It's, like 120 degrees or whatever, but, it's just a sharp angle. And so the sharpener's choil there is big enough to put a finger in there, and so that's a forward choil. Something like this. Now, this is a Ganzo copy of, Spyderco. But what you see right here is we've got our sharpener's choil right there. Got the sharpener's choil right there. And then we've got this section here. That's a forward choil or a finger choil, and some people call this a half and half choil because half of it's on the handle and half of it's on the blade. But it's designed so your hand goes in there, again, getting close to the cutting edge to get more control. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways to make these choils, which are different than sharpener's choils or Spanish notches. What's next? We've got another part that's close to the handle here. This one's going to be a good example of it. It's got quillons on it, both at the top and at the bottom. It's a form of a guard. Now, this knife clearly has got this quillon here, but on this side, it looks like a lot of knives that you see. You just have a flipper tab, and your flipper tab comes all the way through and around the back, and it becomes a quillon or a front quillon or a guard once the knife is in locked position. So your hand is in there. What that stops you from doing is if you plunge into something and pretend this hand is a brick wall, your knife will stop, but your hand might keep going. And so that stops your hand from going up over the cutting edge, or hopefully stops your hand from going up over the cutting edge and slicing your hand to shreds. So that's what those are for. And a lot of flipper knives have that happening for them. So let's show you another example of one. One more part of the knife that we haven't talked about And, well, a couple things. We haven't talked about any knives like this that have this gut hook on the spine of the blade. So that can happen, especially on fixed blade outdoor knives. You can get these gut hooks on them. But on a lot of knives, a lot of folding knives, this one, because it's coated, might not be the best example, is this thing up here. This is a swedge. Some people call it a swage. But it's a point of the blade that goes thinner. It's usually, partway down the blade and all the way to the tip. Although sometimes it's not up there, it's back over here. It's just some removal of material on angle, on the spine of the blade. That's a swedge. Now, it's not a false edge unless it comes very, very thin without being sharpened. So this is still thick enough just to be a swedge, and a false edge is when it comes really, really fine. And then it's a dagger edge if it's sharpened. If you got a cutting edge here and a cutting edge there, then this is a dagger now, because it's got a cutting edge on either side. Let's give you a couple more examples of swedges. This knife has got one. This knife, the Thorn, has one up there. Do I have an example of one odd one? Let me see. Here's an odd one on the S758 by San Remu. So the swedge starts up here, and then it comes up and it terminates way out here, quite far from the edge of the blade. Another few things that we have is we've got a thumb riser. So this is where from the handle, but it's part of the blade, it comes up higher than the handle, and it's a spot to put your thumb. So that's a thumb riser. The thing is, a lot of thumb risers are also having these you know that I know these words, and somehow my brain just goes away from me when I'm making videos. It's called jimping. It's a little bit of steel that's removed, sort of like serrations, but it's not intended to cut at all because it stays flat on the top. But it's just little indentations for the meat of your thumb and all these little ridges in your skin to sort of catch onto to give you a better grip. So thumb riser, and then this one's a riser that's got jimping on it. So you don't have to have a thumb riser. It can be flat like this. Actually, this one's got a thumb riser right there with some jimping. Up here, it's just flat. This knife doesn't have either. This knife here, that doesn't have a riser at all, but it's got some jimping. This knife as well, it actually comes down a little bit already, so the handle's flat and then it starts coming down. And then it's got huge jimping on there and a swedge. Or it's just flat altogether. Let's talk more about this edge here. So we've talked about the sharp edge. I've talked a little bit about this edge that's not sharp. Let's talk some more about it. I mentioned a false edge. Then you've got, this section of the blade. I didn't even talk about this, did I? I mentioned it a few times, but I didn't specifically talk about it. Just that whole edge along there, that's called the spine of the blade, sometimes called the back of the blade. So, but usually spine is a better word for that. The spine of the blade, that back edge, it's usually fairly flat. Sometimes, it's coming down and it's dropping away from the knife. Sometimes it gets swept up into like a Persian style kind of knife, up a trailing point. All kinds of different ways to make, the back of this blade, but that's the spine of the blade right there. That's most of the parts of the knife. That's not everything. That's just most of it. Whoa, hitting this table around the place. Some other things that you have is a fuller, also called, wrongly, in my opinion, a blood groove. So a fuller is a section of steel close to the spine of the blade where material's been taken away. Now, generally, it's believed that the origin of the fuller is on swords, and the purpose is to lighten the sword, take some weight off. That's the generally believed purpose for it. Some people wrongly believe that it makes it easier for blood to flow away or easier to pierce into some flesh so it doesn't create suction. That one might have some validity to it. So if you've got a long fuller like that and you stabbed it into a body, air can come in starting at the back. As long as, you've plunged it in that far, air can come in the back when you go to pull it out to make it easier to remove the blade. I can see some argument there, but it's not for blood to drain away, so it's not a blood groove per se. The purpose on knives like folding knives, decorative. 99% of the time, it's just decorative. Sometimes they do it to lose weight on folding knives as well. It just looks good and looks cool, and it comes in all kinds of shapes and styles and stuff, but it's usually a line of some sort near the spine where material has been taken away. So there's that. Oh, this knife needs some maintenance, big time. Now, some more parts of the knife. The section of the knife, after you've got your main grind and this plunge ends, you've got this section here where the whole knife is just sort of flat. You get the full thickness of the knife all the way across. What's that called? That's called the ricasso, or some people call it a ricasso, but it's this flat section of steel where it's the full thickness from spine to the belly of the blade. It's just flat. There's another name for, this knife. On this knife, you've got this ricasso where it says F002, but then you've got this flat coming all the way up here. I just call it the flat of the blade. So when you've got a full flat grind like this one, comes all the way to the spine, you also get a lot of knives. Very, very common to get knives where you've got a section of the knife going along the spine where it stays the full thickness, and it's just a flat section of the blade. I just call it the flats. So I think we've covered all the basic terminology of the blade that I wanted to get through. Next time we're going to talk about the different types of grinds, saber grind, hollow grind, semi-hollow, Scandi grind, full flat grind, V grind. There's more. There's a whole lot of them. And we're going to talk about blade shapes. So, you've got drop point, you've got bowie, you've got clip point, you've got trailing point, there's a whole load of different blade shapes. So that's going to be the next time, but that might be, 3 or 4 weeks away. And then after that, we'll talk about handles. So it's going to take a while to get this BKN, Badass Knife Newbies series done. And it's going to be a short series, 3 or 4 videos. And I thank you for sticking around and watching this. If you like my channel, if you want to thank me for helping you learn something, consider becoming a Patreon supporter, or even doing something as simple as allowing the advertisements to play at the start of my videos. And if there's another advert at the end of my video, if you let those play, I get a little bit of an income. And if the item in the commercial interests you, click on it, and that helps me out even more, even if you don't buy the product. Or you can simply donate. You can send me an email at canadiancuttingedge@gmail.com and let me know how you want to make a little donation to the channel. Every little bit helps. YouTube is free to upload, but it does take time and money and effort and skill and a whole bunch of stuff to be able to produce these videos. So thank you so much for helping me out. And my goal is to help you out. Any questions or comments down below, or email me directly if you don't want to leave your comments down below for everybody to see. There are no stupid questions, but maybe if you feel like, you might be embarrassed by a question, send me something as simple as possible. I will be kind. I will be... People who write to me know that, I like to really, really help out, and nothing is a stupid question. They're all valid, and you might even help me learn something. I've learned a lot of stuff from newbies, just from questions. So thanks so much for that. Oh, and also on another video, we'll talk about blade finishes as well. So remember, guys, always cut towards your chum, not your thumb.